Our trip started in San Francisco, where leader Mike was able to take our small group around by car.
U.S. took control of this area, and then on January 30th of 1847, they renamed it San Francisco after St. Francis of Assisi. So even then, it wasn't super popular of a city. It didn't become popular and gain a lot of traction until the Gold Rush, which happened. The Gold Rush began in 1848, January of 1848. Settlers found gold in the American River, just east of the city. So shortly after that, the Gold Rush actually happened in 1849, which brought a lot of people from the east.
Our first stop was to see some of the vibrant murals painted on walls in the Mission District. We then moved on to Twin Peaks for an overview of the city.
They just switched it. It was kind of between for flying purposes.
After a quick coffee break, we went to Alamo Square and looked at some of the original Victorian houses known as the Painted Ladies. Next stop was to admire the Golden Gate Bridge. From 1960 to 1964 it was famous for having the longest main suspension span in the world. For the afternoon, we were left to explore the Fisherman's Walk on our own. Of course, this included an alfresco lunch of clam chowder served in a traditional bread bowl. Pier 39 was as busy and lively as one would wish for a waterfront, with activities for all age groups. But the Alcatraz prison was tantalisingly out of reach, as we didn't have time for a visit. Returning to the hotel proved challenging, as some streets are too steep even for cars to negotiate in a straight line. And later there was a little time to visit the North California Cherry Blossom Festival, which was obviously a very popular event in the annual calendar. Next day we had a long drive to Yosemite National Park, where the first stop was the Tuolumne Grove. Once there, we settled down for our picnic lunch, and then we took the trail to see some of the giant sequoia trees. We were surprised to find there was still snow around, but after all, we were now at an elevation of over 2,600 metres. We were pleased to learn that it was only once this tree had died naturally that the tunnel was cut through it. This exhibit demonstrated how old these amazing trees can be, with some reckoned to be over 3,000 years old. From Tuolumne we took a scenic tour, stopping at a point which gave a clear view of the El Capitan and Half Dome climbing faces. El Capitan is in the foreground on the left. Next we ventured extremely close to our first waterfall, the aptly named Bridal Veil Falls. Then it was time to find our hotel for the next 2 nights and to enjoy our first group meal. The following morning we were first taken for a close-up view of Yosemite Falls, the highest in the park at 740 metres. Then Mike explained how we should use the shuttle buses to explore individually.
17, which is just above it.
So we joined the other trekkers enjoying Yosemite Park and set off for the Mist Trail. The track followed the river, and although we took plenty of rest, the full climb was still quite challenging. So while Paul, Anne and Melissa pressed on to the top of the falls, Annette opted to wait and watch the squirrels at play. When Melissa returned, we set off on another trek, eventually reaching Mirror Lake, which would probably have been more spectacular with a higher water level. Then there was just time for a cool-down stretch before catching the bus back. Next day's travels took us past fertile growing land, with a predominant crop of oranges, along with cattle and various other fruit. But when we reached Kings Canyon, we were looking for another famous sequoia tree, which even had a name, the General Sherman tree. Its claim to fame is being the most overall massive of the trees, even though it's not the oldest, being less than 3,000 years old. On leaving the area, we once again encountered one of the frequent hold-ups due to roadworks. But then we wound our way down the mountain, passing some very varied scenery. Soon we passed a new sight for us, a large area devoted to the machinery required for extracting gas and oil through fracking. That evening we stayed in the town of Bakersfield, and the next morning we passed different means of extracting energy, as here there were vast areas devoted both to wind turbines and to solar panels. We also encountered salt extraction, as we were now in the desolate desert area known as Death Valley, where the temperature was 108 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 42 degrees centigrade.
We are in the Mojave Desert, so with location in the southwest U.S. Being low elevation increases the heat, but with the mountain ranges, the way that they're set up is that the heat kind of gets trapped in. It's kind of like a convection oven, where as it gets hot, the heat makes the valley warm, and then it kind of tries to escape. So it's kind of, as it cools, it goes up the sides of the mountains, but then it gets caught up again, gets pushed back down.
After lunch, Mike drove us to Badwater Basin, where we stood in an area covered in salt at 85 metres below sea level. Our next stop showed how the various minerals in the sand and rocks create different colours. And now Zabriskie Point, which is a wondrous erosional landscape created by millions of years of weathering. After another long drive, we arrived at such a different environment as we were to stay in Las Vegas for a night. Mike let us loose on our own, so first we bypassed the swimming pool, and although it was fascinating, we ignored the temptations of the gambling area. We were still a bit overwhelmed, but Melissa asked for advice, and we moved to a neighbouring hotel, which had yet more gambling, of course. But eventually we were directed to a plentiful and varied buffet and were able to enjoy our meal together. Our hotel was situated right alongside the incredible indoor street known as the Fremont Street Experience, so we could spend as much time as we could handle absorbing the entertainment and all the noise and activity. Next day was through different scenery again, which eventually brought us to Zion National Park and more shuttle buses. These took us along the base of the massive canyon until we were able to walk the trail alongside the Virgin River. Only a couple of weeks later this path was closed due to a rockfall which injured tourists. However, we were safe and joined the many visitors who were enjoying having their photos taken here. But there were other intrepid people who were preparing to wade the river and take the Zion Narrows hike deep through the narrowing gorge. However, we knew we didn't have time for that, so instead we took the short climb to Weeping Rock. Once at the top, we were in an alcove, sheltered from the constant shower of water coming from natural springs. Leaving there, our next challenge was the uphill trek to see 3 emerald pools. The first pool was not quite as emerald as we'd hoped, but the surrounding scenery was quite dramatic. The second pool was more lively and of much interest to a younger tourist. The trail went higher still, with a more varied terrain, but again time and energy did not allow reaching the top. So we descended back to river level. Our last walk was to view some remains of long ago valley dwellings. But we were also pleased when we encountered a more modern local resident. That night we stayed at La Quinta Hotel in the nearby town of Springdale. And in the morning we were to join fellow trekkers on the Zion Canyon Rim Walk. This was obviously considered suitable even for young travellers, but nonetheless it was a long drop to the canyon floor for the unwary. But once there, we enjoyed the wonderful view, overlooking the area of yesterday's travels. And then we spent a little time relaxing. After a further drive, we reached the Red Canyon.
Theories that the ancient natives used to kind of believe in about what the hoodoos are and things like that when we sit down for lunch, so I'll get into that a little bit more.
Red Canyon is only 12 miles away from Bryce Canyon, our next destination. The short walk gave us a foretaste of what we were to see later, as we gazed at these extraordinary orange and red limestone rock formations. The native Indian people called them hoodoos, believing them to be petrified followers of the coyote god who had been turned to stone as they listened to him. We arrived next at Bryce National Park, which was at our highest altitude so far, at 8,300 feet, or 2,500 metres. As soon as we arrived, there was plenty to be photographed, from the natural bridge to balancing stones. But there we were set to trek down into the base of the canyon, together with a good many other tourists. Along the way we were again fascinated by the hoodoos, which are actually natural rock formations carved and eroded by the forces of nature. At the base of the canyons the crowds had thinned out, and we could enjoy the relative peace and tranquility, along with this golden-mantled ground squirrel. In due course we were back at the canyon rim and could pause to admire these surreal formations in multicoloured sandstone. Water has played the main part in creating this remarkable landscape, with constant freezing and thawing, causing the soft rocks to erode and split into towering pillars which litter the floor of this great amphitheatre. The process is continual due to the fact that temperatures here fluctuate from hot afternoons to the freezing nights, which we were about to experience at Briceview Lodge. Here we again had a buffet-style group meal. Next morning we were up early, literally before dawn, in order to watch the sunrise over the fairy tale land of Bryce Canyon. As we look out over the pink, red and orange spires, we can sympathise with Ebenezer Bryce, a Mormon farmer who, while seeking his lost cattle, found this area and was quoted as saying, "It's a hell of a place to lose a cow." Following that colourful spectacle, we moved to quite a different area, the Grand Staircase Escalante, a place of peace and solitude that is said to be the most unexplored area of the United States of America. Mike found us a welcoming cafe for our breakfast coffee break, and we had an opportunity to admire pendant ornaments carved just from the local sandstone rocks. Looking at the scenery outside, it was easy to see how this could be done. We were now in the Capitol Reef National Park. Here Mike had planned another short trek for us, which proved rather hot and blustery as we climbed to circumnavigate this stack known as Chimney Rock. But then it was on to something quite different. looking at the petroglyphs or carved rock pictures created by the people who lived here around 1,500 years ago. After our lunch break in the area known as Fruta, we took a look at life in a more recent era. This was the late 1800s, when the land was settled by hardy Mormon pioneers who survived on their own resources by teaching themselves to become self-sufficient farmers. The landscape was flat and desolate as we travelled from the Capitol Reef Park to Canyonlands. But here we found another extraordinary sandstone rock formation known as the Mesa Arch. Although it is most famed for the view through it at sunrise, we were just looking for the best photos at that time of day. We took a short walk from there and reached the Canyonlands Grand Viewpoint, where the Colorado and Green Rivers have shaped the landscape into these incredible canyons. Our stop for the night was in nearby Moab, and from there it was only a short distance to the Arches National Park. First we took a stroll along Park Avenue, so named because the early visitors thought it reminded them of buildings lining a city street. Then onto the balanced rocks, which are formed because the sandstone rock at the top is of harder material than the mudstone pedestal, and so they're shaped differently by the weather. This national park contains over 2,000 arches, so of course we only saw a few of them. But climbing up into Double Arch gave a panoramic view across the plain. At our next stop we reached the north window, and there we took a seat to admire the view. A short walk from there was the south window, and as we left we were able to photograph them both at once. Then we had a longer trek to reach Delicate Arch. There were many warnings about precautions to be taken on this 3-mile round trip, as the rocks can be slippery, there's no shade, and the climb is also quite steep. Finally, we had to traverse along a rock ledge, which could be considered quite daunting. But eventually we could sit and finally view the arch, which framed the snow-clapped mountains behind. Mike managed to find us a relatively sheltered spot to rest, while we watched everyone else having their photos taken. Eventually we decided to join the crowd, looking minuscule in our only group photo. When you look at the area from this angle, the forces of nature that created this delicate arch seem more wondrous than can be imagined. Although the land seemed desolate, it was certainly not devoid of life, with ravens and chipmunks joining the crowds, as well as varied plant life. And it was good to see hardy American youngsters being brought along to appreciate their national parks.
It's a little harder through this section.
A different, shorter trail was now taking us to another photogenic spot, the Landscape Arch. It is 290 feet long and now only 6 feet thick at the narrowest section. People used to be able to walk underneath it, but during the 1990s, 3 large sandstone slabs, measuring up to 70 feet long, had fallen from it, so the trail was very sensibly closed. The next part of this trail was listed as primitive and difficult, and it did seem to involve a lot of clambering, so most of us decided that discretion was the better part of valour and opted for a safe return to base level. The trail would have taken us to various further arches, but one is now missing. It was known as Wall Arch, the 12th largest in the park, and it dramatically and completely collapsed in August 2008. Fortunately, no one was hurt. From there we moved to Broken Arch, where we were able to get very close to the formations. The arch itself may not be as impressive as some others, but these children were enjoying the real sand. And Mike couldn't resist a little more exploring.
Can we have your car keys before you
We stayed at Moab again that night, but next morning we moved off the highway to a dusty dirt road, winding over 1,000 feet high up steep inclines to the plateau known as Muley Point. From there the plain stretched out from us, but we also saw the layered cliffs creating canyons around the San Juan River. We only stopped for a break and to admire the view, but it appeared that hardier folk enjoyed the wild camping. After winding our way back down, we reached a strange formation, unsurprisingly known as Mexican Hat, a boulder precariously perched on an eroded pedestal. But we were on our way to the filmmaker's paradise of Monument Valley, and first we had to stop at this iconic viewpoint made famous in the film Forrest Gump. When we reached the valley, we entered the tribal park of the Navajo Nation, and first paused to try and orientate ourselves with the various films we'd seen over the years.
And up here,
But some of us had chosen to join a tour of the area, which was led by Wayne.
Apache Warrior. 1, 2, 3. Woo!
We helped him prove that the place echoed. He then showed us various rock formations and ancient petroglyphs,
9 to 1,200 years old, they say.
and then we were given a glimpse of the traditional way of life of the Navajo
All
people.
gone. Cross reservation, the doorway, always facing east.
Right.
That's where the sun rises. And what she's doing now is she's carding, okay?
Yeah.
She's softening up the wool, cleaning the wool from dirt, dust, tweaks, or whatever. Make it real puffy.
We were delighted when finally Wayne treated us to some traditional music. This evening we were at a totally different location, alongside Lake Powell. The area was beautifully maintained and very peaceful for morning walks. But it seemed most of the hotel guests were here to go on scenic ferry trips on the lake. The weather had now changed, but we were going to look more closely at the Glen Canyon Dam, which is second in size to the Hoover Dam. In the visitor centre we could read about the construction of the dam in 1964 and the inevitable controversy surrounding the project. However, it had now stopped raining and we were joining hundreds of other tourists walking to another viewpoint. The excitement was caused by seeing this incredible feat of nature known as Horseshoe Bend, which is a deeply incised meander of the Colorado River. Even apart from the crowds, it was difficult to encompass the entire bend in one photograph, but Mike helpfully managed to do so. From here, we reached our last national park, that of the Grand Canyon, and we found that the weather had changed yet again, not being at all as we'd expected. The views were pretty limited at that time, but this did not deter our fellow travellers from getting their photographs. However, we moved into the warmer environment to be found in the Desert View Watchtower, where there was plenty of interesting things to see. When we emerged, the visibility had improved, so pictures were again being captured. But as the evening drew in, we moved around the canyon rim to join the crowds waiting to watch the sunset. As the sun dropped, we each found a relatively quiet area, but Mike chose to take himself to a particularly solitary spot. Eventually the sun had gone to rest, and we went back to settle ourselves for the night. Next morning we were back onto shuttle buses, and Paul, Anne and Annette opted to see how much of the Bright Angel Trail they could manage. Joining plenty of other trekkers, we gradually worked our way lower into the canyon. And when we came to the point known as the 1.5 Mile Rest House, we decided it would be the best place for some respite before setting off on the return journey. I'm afraid we certainly had not put in nearly as much effort as the hardy trekkers who had probably been 3 times as far to the Indian Garden campsite, or even to the Bright Angel campground by the river, and spent at least a night there before returning, laden with all their belongings. Looking back, we could see much of the trail we had taken, as well as the further distance that we didn't cover. Safely arrived back on the rim, the notice confirmed that we had climbed the equivalent of 112 flights of stairs. And here's the photo to show we made it. As we walked to different viewpoints along the south rim, we were able to see the route of our recent expedition more clearly. Each promontory gave us a different view of the canyon. And here we even got a brief glimpse of the Colorado River itself. As we took the bus back to our hotel, we passed some of the many elk grazing in the area. That evening, we all went to a local Mexican restaurant for our last group meal, although it proved rather a noisy venue at which to thank Mike for being such a great leader. Next morning, Annette was the only one to take a flight over the canyon with Maverick helicopters. We first crossed the Kaibab National Forest before getting our first glimpse of the winding Colorado River. We flew both high and low over the canyon, and all the while our pilot was pointing out the highlights and points of interest. The river averages 90 metres wide and was first travelled in 1869, when the unexplored rapids made the venture hazardous indeed. Nowadays it is possible to book a week's holiday, experiencing the thrill of over 60 whitewater rapids while rafting along 188 miles. After a breathtaking 45 minutes, it was time to land and join the rest of the group, who were setting off to travel the remains of the historic Route 66. We first visited the town of Williams. Then we moved to Seligman and found we were lucky enough to arrive on the same day that a classic car rally was being held. The vintage cars here obviously held a great deal of interest for the younger generation. Then after lunch we had another long drive to our final destination, which was back in Las Vegas. This time Mike drove us through the Strip, and though we didn't have time to actually visit any of these world-famous hotels, casinos and shops, at least we could get some idea of the prevailing atmosphere, so that we could return some other time. For our last night, we were back at the Golden Nugget Hotel, where we gathered for a final drink to celebrate the end of this active, varied and busy holiday,